Well, welcome again, everyone. I see most of you came back, so apparently it wasn't too boring. That's always a good thing when people come back for history. We'll start off with a little bit of review from last week, just to kind of catch us up. It's been a week, and maybe for anyone that was not able to make it last week that is here this week. So our overview for our second day, we're going to focus on the first part. We're going to go from about the year 476 to about the year 1054, the church fractures. Why are there two separate churches, one east that we commonly call the Orthodox Church, and one west, which is the Catholic Church, as well as the other Protestant churches today? Our second part will be the Crusades and their effect, and what role does the Crusades have in the lead up to the Protestant Reformation? We will not get to the Protestant Reformation this week. That I hold out for the last week to hopefully get people to come back. So, here is our review from last week's session. Just a couple dates here, kind of thrown at you real quick. The years 50 to 100, the Christian scriptures are written. The year 70, the Jewish temple is destroyed. The year 80 to about the year 300, we have the cult of the martyrs develops, and Christianity moves up the social ladder. 313, we have the Edict of Milan, where Constantine legalizes Christianity. A couple years later, in the year 325, Constantine holds the Council of Nicaea. The year 330, he founded his own city of Constantinople. Just kind of review what the Council of Nicaea was about. It was said that you couldn't buy bread without arguing over the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. This Council of Nicaea in the year 325 settled some fundamental issues of Christianity, namely the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. It allowed Christians for the first time to be able to state their beliefs with a quote-unquote scholarly approach. The council was called to answer some of the charges that the priest Arius had brought against the nature of Jesus Christ and Jesus' nature to God the Father. A little more review. The founding of Constantinople makes concrete a reality in the Roman world that there are two halves, shown on the projector here, one east and one west. They are not equal, and they are slowly sliding apart. I hope you folks remember that from last week because I use it a lot. Like I said, it looked really good in 3D. We'll be there someday, I hope. The western part of the empire, the language was Latin. The barbarians invaded and repeatedly attacked, and cities were not as well established. Whereas the eastern part, the Orange, the east used the language of Greek. The barbarians repelled due to a stronger military, as well as bribery, and ancient cities that were wealthier. In our last little review, the year 380, there's a Council of Constantinople that adds to the part about the Nicene Creed with the respect to the Holy Spirit. The year 410, the city of Rome is sacked. The year 421, there's another ecumenical council of Ephesus. 451, there's a fourth council, the Council of Chalcedon. And then finally, where we ended up last week in the year 476, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So we just breezed through 476 years of history. Hopefully for folks, if there's anyone that's not here from last week, hopefully that catches you up. And for the rest of us, kind of gets us to set the stage of where we are at for this evening's discussion. So kind of back to this, I kind of talked last week, some of this, our sessions seem like Western Civ, and that's because what happens in the Roman Empire directly ties to what happens into Christianity. As we saw on the one slide that kind of pops out at you, East and West are slowly sliding apart, and this starts with the dissolution of a united empire between East and West. So Eastern and Western Christianity is slowly beginning to drift apart as well. Language was a major issue, as was the role of the leader in each half. So the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is the leader of Western Christianity. But not only as the Bishop of Rome and the Pope, he was also kind of in charge of the city. You have a question, George?
So what did they call Christianity as a whole before the Eastern-Western split?
The church. Just Christianity. It was, it was really a unified church. So they just called it Christianity or the church. So we're slowly kind of sliding apart between East and West here. So the leader of the Eastern Church is the Patriarch of Constantinople. So you can kind of see where the capitals of each empire, Western, the former capital of the Empire of Rome, how the Bishop of Rome there is preeminent, and then Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, that is led by the Patriarch. Under the protection of a strong empire, he's more concerned with spiritual matters. That's not to say that the Pope or the Bishop of Rome is not concerned with spiritual matters, but he also is kind of the mayor of Rome. So he has to take charge of the city, make sure the people get fed, make sure the water still works, things like that. So the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, as well as a lot of other Western clergy, as the empire collapses and falls apart in the Western world, they're the ones that kind of take charge of the welfare of the people. Just to kind of just make sure it's clear when I'm just talking about Western and Eastern Christianity, that originally it referred to geographical changes. The map we had showing West based in Rome and East based in Constantinople. You may hear those terms today and today in reference to the type of Christianity that we have, but there is Eastern Orthodox throughout the entire world, just as there are Catholics throughout the entire world. So we still kind of use those terms today of Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, but they have their roots back in the geography of where each was really based at in the ancient world. Because I still like that sound effect. The people that caused the collapse of the Western Roman Empire were just as Roman as the people of Rome. They wanted to imitate the glory of Rome and kept many of its civic structures in place in the lands that they had conquered, but they were unable to maintain them for the simple reason that once the empire in the West collapsed, there is really no central authority to maintain the roads, to collect taxes, to field an army. And so it's the church that kind of comes in and is the one that maintains some of the civic institution, but unfortunately most of them do collapse. That's why we call this period of Western European history the Dark Ages. While these people were ultimately responsible for some sacks of cities, killings, they did cut the aqueducts into the city of Rome. They were not the ravaging, pillaging horde that the word barbarian seems to kind of conjure to the mind. So we kind of talked about last week, we'll do a little bit of a saint feature. We'll talk a little bit and then we'll do a saint feature. So our saint feature for this little bit of history is Saint Pope Gregory I, who lived between 450 and the year 604. Pope Gregory wanted to retire as a monk, but the church had different ideas, and he was made a pope in the year 590. He was also the first pope from a monastic background. One of the things we talked about last week was the rise of the monastic movement of monks and such. And so Pope Gregory was the first one to come from this background. Before he was named pope, he was also the papal representative in the city of Constantinople. So the churches would have representatives in each capital. Gregory is also a very prolific writer, mostly his homilies and commentaries on the scriptures that you can still read to this day. Pope Gregory also sent missionaries to Christianize the Anglo-Saxon tribes, that is, the people that were in England. While some of the Celtic people in England and so had remained Christian after Rome pulled back its legions in 410, most of the people reverted back to their pagan ways. So Gregory sends representatives to make Christian once again England. He's responsible for the introduction of the Gregorian chant and liturgical reforms that remove some of the Eastern influences from the Roman liturgy. Now going back to Western Civ a little bit, this picture is a picture of the Emperor Justinian, who ruled between 527 and 565. So this period of history, we're kind of done with speaking of a unified Roman Empire. The empire in the West has collapsed. When we say the word emperor here, we're referring to the empire that remains in the city of Constantinople, that most historians call the Byzantine Empire, and that's how I refer to it from this point forward. It really is a continuation of the Roman Empire in the East and lasts till the year 1453. So Justinian kind of thought it was ironic. His title was still the Emperor of Rome, Roman Emperor, but he did not control the city of Rome. Thought that was a little ironic. So he decides to send an imperial expedition over to Italy to essentially reconquer Rome. to make it so his title of Roman emperor is true. He is emperor of the city of Rome. They also instituted imperial authority once again over Western Africa and parts of Spain. However, these victories were short-lived because the emperor had to do one thing that no politician ever wants to do, and that is to raise taxes. Justinian was also responsible for this idea that there is one God, and because there's one God, there's one empire, and because there's one empire, there is one church that would direct the Eastern Christian Church for many, many years. The Emperor Justinian also recodified Roman law that still serves as the basis for continental European law. So something that happened 15 years ago still has effects on how law is determined in Europe to this day. The picture here is a building that Justinian constructed. It's the Church of the Hagia Sophia. It's the greatest church in the world, and for the next 1,000 years or so. When the church was conquered by the Turks in the 1400s, it became a mosque, and that's why you can kind of see the Arabic symbols on the side. One of the stories is that when this occurred, this was the greatest church in Christendom, that the Greeks who were inhabitants of the city knew that or were told by the Islamic rulers that they needed to paint over all the wonderful pictures that were in the basilica, or the cathedral, I'm sorry. They did it in such a way that the mosaics, that the paintings underneath were actually saved. Now, we're not sure if this was because they wanted to maintain these beautiful paintings and mosaics underneath the paint, and they did that through skill or luck, or the hopes that one day the church would once again become a church again and not a mosque. But however this happened, it fortunately allows modern day archaeologists to be able to go in, and you can kind of see over here where there's angels. They scraped away the paint over the years and have revealed some of the paintings that were underneath. So very cool that they were able to do this. Justinian's reconquering of the city of Rome begins a 300-year period known as the Byzantine Papacy. During this period, the Pope was appointed by either the emperor or the emperor's representative in the city of Ravenna, which is south of modern-day Venice. The military expeditions of Justinian draws the resources of the empire away from the east, where something else is about to arise. And that something that is about to arise is the Islamic faith. Muhammad founded the Islamic faith in around 610, and over the next 23 years or so, compiled the Quran, the holy book. His followers were extremely successful in military expeditions due to the weakness of the Byzantine Empire. They tore Egypt and the rest of Africa away from the empire rather quickly. Last week I mentioned that there was this Coptic church, the Christian church that is in Egypt, that continues to this day. And these were the people that remained Christian after the Islamic people came through and conquered their territory. For the most part, the Islamic forces moved with great speed, not necessarily because they were better fighters, but because the Byzantine garrisons, the people that were there, they were really tired of paying taxes to Constantinople. And because of these taxes, they didn't see their money being well used. It's kind of like today when we joke about money going to Washington, D.C., and none of it ever comes back to us. Well, that same thing occurred in the ancient world as well. And so they would see their money leave. Basically, they thought it was funding various civil wars because an emperor would reign for 2 or 3 years, and then somebody else would come up and depose him, and then 3 or 4 years later, this emperor might get deposed by somebody else. So there's kind of some civil wars going on and strife. So when the Islamic forces came through, they essentially said to the people, you can remain Christian and pay a tax, but it's going to be a less tax than what you're paying to Constantinople, the Byzantines, as of this time. So when the forces were coming through, in some places they allowed the Islamic forces to take over away from the Byzantine Empire because they just didn't want to pay taxes. So here's the rapid expansion of the Islamic world. Red here, Saudi Arabia or so is under the Prophet Muhammad from about the year 622 to the year 632. The light red is another caliphate, or the Islamic State, a term we're all familiar with nowadays. The Rashid Caliphate in the year 632 to 661. And then finally we can see the expansion under the Umayyad Caliphate, and I hope I pronounce these right, in orange. So we can see in a period of about 130 years how the Islamic world races out of Saudi Arabia, takes over the Middle East, North Africa, most of Spain, and even parts of southern France. Islam rapidly takes control of three patriarchal sees. Last week we talked about the 5 great ancient churches of Christianity, leaving only 2, Rome and Constantinople. Here's that point I just kind of made earlier about raising taxes. People tired of paying taxes to a far-off government. So what this means for our Byzantine Empire is that the sudden expansion of Islam and how fast it expands takes away territories that were part of the Byzantine Empire. The emperors began to wonder if God had removed God's protective hand from God's own empire. So in response, Emperor Leo III, who reigned between the year 717 to 741, forbade the use, creation, or even the possessions of icons within the Byzantine Empire. We have pictured here in the background an icon of Mary with the child Jesus. And an icon is a traditional Eastern thought process to be able to pray. We have 4 of them within the church, for those of you that have taken our church tour before. But it is really an Eastern way to pray. And the term icon is a Greek word meaning window. So as you're praying with an icon, you're supposed to kind of look into it, look through the icon, see the window of what you're supposed to be meditating on. In this case, meditating on Mary with the child Jesus. One of the things that Islam forbids is the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, of God, or any of the other prophets who Islamic people would say would have been Jesus, Moses, Isaac, the great prophets of Israel as well. So this emperor, who does this without any clerical consultation, just decides of his own accord that, you know what, one of the reasons perhaps that the Islamic forces are moving so quick is they don't have these pictures, these icons, these statues, if you will, of great people within the early church. So this period becomes known as iconoclasm. And iconoclasm is a term essentially just means the smashing of icons. So throughout the Byzantine world, any of the icons were left, they were smashed, they were destroyed, they were melted down. And it becomes an historical irony of all things that some of the greatest ancient works of Byzantine icons is actually in Italy now, because Italy was spared this destruction of the icons. Christians in the West, under the Pope, protested this destruction of works of art. And so we mentioned the Byzantine papacy earlier. So this finally kind of brings an end to the Byzantine papacy, where the Pope is no longer being chosen by the emperor. The Pope will now be chosen by the people of Rome. Importantly for us, this smashing of icons was not resolved until the Second Council of Nicaea. Remember, Nicaea is a town kind of right outside the city of Constantinople. And it is the last recognized ecumenical council between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. We as Catholics recognize 21 ecumenical councils. Our Orthodox brothers and sisters only recognize these first 7. So this iconoclasm strains an already troubled relationship between East and West. And so just like the Roman Empire drifting apart, Eastern and Western Christianity are drifting apart. Just because I love that slide. At some point it's going to look so cool in 3D. just kind of remind us again what other things that broke apart Western and Eastern Empire, we can start to see some of these things are slowly breaking apart the Eastern and Western Church as well. Now it's time for some table discussion. We'll see how these questions go over, because I realized when I was looking at this presentation about 4 o'clock this afternoon, I didn't have any table questions, and I know Faye really likes to have table discussion. So, one of the things I mentioned is that as the Islamic forces would come in, they would give people a choice. Maybe I didn't mention it, but I'll mention it now. They gave people a choice. You could either pay the tax, remain Christian, or you can convert to Islam and not pay the tax. At some point, most people would probably decide that I don't want to pay the tax until they become a member of the Islamic faith. Incidentally, if you wanted to move up in the social ladder, you had to be a member of the Islamic faith. If you were a Christian or a Jewish person, you could not move up the social ladder. You couldn't hold important government jobs, things of that nature. So you can see over time, while the North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East was all Christian. I mean, the Middle East is the heart of Christianity. North Africa was where some of the greatest Christian thinkers resided, St. Augustine. So, what happens to these people of these Christianity? Do they decide to remain Christian? As we see over time, most of them become Islamic because it's mostly Muslim now, with the exception of that 10% in Egypt. So, my tricky question for you is this. If you were in a land taken over by a foreign religion, would you stay a Christian, or would you be tempted to convert? And because this is occurring to this day, what are some things we as Christians can do for our brothers and sisters facing this question today? Would you convert? It's kind of a personal question, but that's why I have the second one to hopefully foster some more discussion. What are some things we can do? I know there's a big one that I think of right away, but I think there's other things we can do as well. So how can we help our brothers and sisters that are facing this question today in the area in the Middle East? So let's take about 5 minutes or so and look at those thorny questions. Does anybody have anything else? I do like that prayer. That's the one that I kind of kept coming back to when I was, figuring this question out. What are some really good answers? And prayers are really, could be the best thing we could do for our brothers and sisters out there. So
Maybe we could help them move.
help them move.
So have we really been, when you think about it, have we ever not been fractured? In a sense.
As a church?
Well, as I look at the Middle East today, and you look at it back in the early times like you're talking about with the kind of schism that was taking place, have we really recovered from the kind of fracture that's taken place if we are so divided in this world, especially over the Middle East?
Pope John Paul II told us that the church needs to breathe with both lungs, and that's east and west. And one of the things I hope, if one of my great hopes with this is, if nothing else, folks get a greater understanding of the Eastern Orthodox Church, because it's a church that here in the Midwest we just don't have a lot of experience with. There is one church downtown, but other than that we don't have a lot of experience with them. I have not had the opportunity to attend a divine liturgy, but I hear they're kind of mass on steroids with a lot of smoke and bells and that type of thing. Plus they are, I believe I hear a half-day affair or such. So if nothing else, I hope that this discussion helps us to understand when we say the Eastern Orthodox, those people that are our brothers and sisters, kind of what their experience is and what their belief is. So. And then hopefully with that, we can hopefully find a way so that we can hopefully at some point, come back together.
When you say Eastern Orthodox, is that an umbrella for a number of different beliefs and which ones?
Eastern Orthodox, yes, is kind of an umbrella. The way that the Orthodox Church, and I'm trying not to get too ahead of myself here, but the Orthodox Church eventually kind of fractures into different churches that are based upon nationality more than anything else. So there's the Greek Orthodox Church, there's the Serbian Orthodox Church, there's the Russian Orthodox Church, And they all believe that the Patriarch of Constantinople, who's the bishop more than anything else of Constantinople, is a first among equals, in that while that person they look at him as that person is not really able to, he speaks for them a little bit, but doesn't really have any jurisdiction over them. So he's kind of a figurehead, but kind of not. It's an interesting way that they look at their leader. And so the orthodoxy is an umbrella term for all of these different churches that are in communion with each other. For the most part, they have the same belief system, but they're really divided amongst individual countries. John?
So, Jason, so as opposed to the Eastern Orthodox, would it be the Western Unorthodox?
They may say that about us, yes. Yeah.
Just as another point, everybody over there, I had a friend of mine who was a member of the Antiochian Orthodox Church. He traced his church, he expounded to me about his church traces its roots directly back to the Apostle Paul in Antioch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of these churches have that ancient.
5 metropolitans in the United States.
So thank you. Yeah, they do a really good job of tracing everything back. George?
Hasn't there already been great progress towards mending the schism?
Yes, that's about my talk next week. We'll get back to that. So come back next week. But yes, there has been a lot of good progress in the last 50, 60 years. So I keep dropping these little teasers, so hopefully everybody comes back, but we'll see what happens.
Bring the right snacks, we'll be here.
So continuing on with our discussion, with Constantinople, with the Byzantine, I'm sorry, I want to get back to a point that Janice kind of made. I just want to make sure everybody's clear on this. When I asked about paying taxes before, it was in reference to paying taxes to the civil authority, the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't about tithing or paying taxes back to a church. I just want to make sure that point was clear, and if it was unclear for anybody else, I apologize. But the taxes was back to the civil authority, just like we pay taxes today.
And Jason, how was the church supported there?
By the state. With Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire bogged down with wars against Islam. The Byzantine Emperor is going against this orthodox teaching, this right teaching about this smashing of icons. And then as Italy slips away from the imperial orbit, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, begins to look away from Constantinople for protection. Remember, this is the Dark Ages, a lot of bad things going on. And so another Pope Leo, this is Pope Leo III, not to be confused with Emperor Leo III we heard earlier about, crowns a Frankish king by the name of Charles as Imperator Romanum, or Emperor of the Romans. This state that Charles the Great, or we more commonly know him as Charlemagne, becomes the Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire, who lived between 1694 and 1778, who had quite the wit, remarks towards the end of the state that it is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It is also a very highly decentralized structure, a trait that will affect Christianity later on. The Holy Roman Empire is basically modern-day Germany or so. It had some parts in France and would kind of ebb and flow. But essentially it was modern-day Germany with Austria and some other territories added to it as well. This coronation of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans is another event that helps lead us up to the Great Schism between East and West. There is one more event that leads us to the Great Schism, and this is the introduction of the Filioque clause into the Nicene Creed by Western Christianity. The original Nicene Creed does not have "and of the Son" with reference to the Holy Spirit. Filioque is a Latin term for "and of the Son." So when we say the Creed, we say it as, "I believe in the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and of the Son." So the italicized is that Latin term Filioque. This was a slow-moving addition to the Creed that really kind of started in Germanic areas and spreads to the west the rest of Western Christianity. Theologically, this is the greatest area of disagreement between the Eastern and Western churches. The thought process behind this is that some Eastern Christians or Orthodox accept that that is a distinct possibility, that the Holy Spirit can proceed from both Father and the Son. They all disagree with the way in which it made it into the Creed. Their thought process is, because the Creed was formulated at an ecumenical council of Nicaea and Constantinople, that it would have to be changed at an ecumenical council. Well, the Orthodox haven't recognized one of those since the 700s. And if you look at the way Orthodox theology kind of works, they need an emperor almost to call a ecumenical council. Well, unfortunately, there is no longer a Roman emperor anymore. So that's one of the conundrums why there has not been an ecumenical council in the Orthodox world that they even kind of recognize since the 700s. They've had great gatherings. In fact, there was one, I believe it was last year, where the Patriarch of Constantinople, the bishop, tried to gather in all the other leaders of the various churches that make up Eastern Orthodoxy, and they really couldn't even agree on some of the certain basic things, like where to even meet and where. So this filioque, just this, in English, 3 little words, and of the Son, has a great historical and theological difference for Orthodox brothers and sisters. The other major area of disagreement is the role of the papacy, the role of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Eastern, that's Orthodox Catholics, accept that the See of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, is the first among equals. Here's our first among equals term. Theologically, we call this the Petrine primacy. As Catholics, we derive this from Matthew 16:18, where Jesus tells Peter that he is the rock that he will build a church upon. So both Orthodox and Catholic Christians recognize this as St. Peter, that St. Peter was the leader of the apostles. And he does go to Rome, he does die there, and because of that, we call the See of Rome also the See of St. Peter, the bishopric of St. Peter. What they disagree with is the manner in which the Pope exercises his authority. Theologically, we call this the Petrine function. So that's, where here in the Catholic Church, our bishops are assigned by Rome. There is no one that has created a bishop without Rome's knowledge, without Rome giving that its blessing. The Orthodox Church has a little bit different understanding of how a bishop is chosen. And so their leader, their bishops, their main leader, the bishop, the patriarch, doesn't have the same kind of function. He doesn't interfere with various dioceses, with the other churches, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, things of that nature, whereas we as Catholics are a lot more centralized. And so the Pope, he's got the Curia, all those people that work with him to help further the mission of the church. The Eastern Orthodox just don't have that bureaucracy like we do. And that derives from this Petrine function, the Pope governing the church in the way that the Pope does. Another minor area is, as learning is, the light of learning is distinguished in the West, there are fewer people who understand the language of Greek. And it becomes difficult for the Western Church to understand and translate correctly what are some of the things going on in the Eastern world, what's being said in Greek. And so hopefully we've gotten to the point, we've explained a lot of these differences, that it should come as no surprise what happens in the year 1054. And that's when the separation really formally occurs, when East and West churches finally break apart from each other. Papal representatives and the ecumenical patriarch excommunicate one another. The ironic thing about this excommunication is that the cardinal who had been sent by the Pope to basically have discussions with the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicates the Patriarch. However, the Pope has died by this point. So in actuality, he can't excommunicate anybody because his authority is no longer there because the Pope has passed away. So a little bit of irony there. But they do excommunicate each other. It is said that when Cardinal Hubert walks out of the great church, Hagia Sophia, this picture we have as well, he kind of shook his dust off his feet and walked out of the great church. So unfortunately, to this day, there exists a Western Roman Catholic and the Protestant traditions, and an Eastern Orthodox Christianity.